Chapter 32. The personal conviction and force of such an individual as the Reverend Macmillan, while in one sense an old story to Clyde and not anything which so late as 18 months before could have moved him in any way, since all his life he had been accustomed to something like it, still here, under these circumstances, affected him differently. Incarcerated, withdrawn from the world, compelled by the highly circumscribed nature of this death-house life to find solace or relief in his own thoughts, Clyde's, like every other temperament similarly limited, was compelled to devote itself either to the past, the present or the future. But the past was so painful to contemplate at any point. It seared and burned. And the present, his immediate surroundings, as well as the future with its deadly fear of what was certain to happen in case his appeal failed, were two phases equally frightful to his waking consciousness. What followed then was what invariably follows in the wake of every tortured consciousness. From what it dreads or hates, yet knows or feels to be unescapable, it takes refuge in that which may be hoped for, or at least imagined. But what was to be hoped for or imagined? Because of the new suggestion offered by Nicholson, a new trial was all that he had to look forward to, in which case, and assuming himself to be acquitted thereafter, he could go far, far away, to Australia, or Africa, or Mexico, or some such place as that, where, under a different name, his old connections and ambitions relating to that superior social life that had so recently intrigued him, laid aside, he might recover himself in some small way. But directly in the path of that hopeful imagining, of course, stood the death's head figure of a refusal on the part of the Court of Appeals to grant him a new trial. Why not, after that jury at Bridgeburg? And then, as in that dream in which he turned from the tangle of snakes to face the tramping rhinoceros with its two horns, he was confronted by that awful thing in the adjoining room, that chair. That chair. Its straps and its flashes which so regularly dimmed the lights in this room. He could not bear to think of his entering there, ever. And yet supposing his appeal was refused. Away. He would like to think no more about it. But then, apart from that, what was there to think of? It was that very question that up to the time of the arrival of the Reverend Duncan Macmillan, with his plea for a direct and certainly, as he insisted, fruitful appeal to the Creator of all things, that had been definitely torturing Clyde. Yet see, how simple was his solution. It was given unto you to know the peace of God, he insisted, quoting Paul and thereafter sentences from Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, on how easy it was, if Clyde would but repeat and pray as he had asked him to, for him to know and delight in the peace that passeth all understanding. It was with him, all around him. He had but to seek, confess the miseries and errors of his heart, and express contrition. Ask, and ye shall receive, seek, and ye shall find, knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh, receiveth, and he that seeketh, findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. For what man is there of you whom, if his son ask bread, will give him a stone, or, if he ask fish, will give him a serpent? So he quoted, beautifully and earnestly. And yet before Clyde always was the example of his father and mother. What had they? It had not availed them much, praying. Neither, as he noticed here, did it appear to avail or aid these other condemned men, the majority of whom lent themselves to the pleas or prayers of either priest or rabbi or minister, one and the other of whom was about daily. Yet were they not led to their death just the same? And complaining or protesting, or mad like Cutrone, or indifferent. As for himself, up to this he had not been interested by any of these bunk notions. Of what? He could not say. Nevertheless, here was the appealing Reverend Duncan Macmillan. His mild, serene eyes. His sweet voice. His faith. It moved and intrigued Clyde deeply. Could there? He was so lonely, so despairing, so very much in need of help. Was it not also true, the teaching of the Reverend Macmillan, influencing him to that extent at least, that if he had led a better life, had paid more attention to what his mother had said and taught, not gone into that house of prostitution in Kansas City, or pursued Hortense Briggs in the evil way that he had, or after her, Roberta, had been content to work and save, as no doubt most men were, would he not be better off than he now was? But then again, there was the fact or truth of those very strong impulses and desires within himself that were so very, very hard to overcome. He had thought of those, too, and then of the fact that many other people like his mother, his uncle, his cousin, and this minister here, did not seem to be troubled by them. And yet also he was given to imagining at times that perhaps it was because of superior mental and moral courage in the face of passions and desires, equivalent to his own, which led these others to do so much better. He was perhaps just willfully devoting himself to these other thoughts and ways, as his mother and Macmillan and most everyone else whom he had heard talk since his arrest seemed to think. What did it all mean? Was there a God? Did he interfere in the affairs of men as Mr. Macmillan was now contending? Was it possible that one could turn to him, or at least some creative power, in some such hour as this and when one had always ignored him before, and ask for aid? Decidedly one needed aid under such circumstances, so alone and ordered and controlled by law, not man, since these, all of them, were the veriest servants of the law. But would this mysterious power be likely to grant aid? Did it really exist and hear the prayers of men? The Reverend Macmillan insisted yes. He hath said God hath forgotten, he hideth his face. But he has not forgotten. He has not hidden his face. But was that true? Was there anything to it? Tortured by the need of some mental if not material support in the face of his great danger, Clyde was now doing what every other human in related circumstances invariably does, seeking, and yet in the most indirect and involute and all but unconscious way, the presence or existence at least of some superhuman or supernatural personality or power that could and would aid him in some way, beginning to veer, however slightly or unconsciously as yet toward the personalization and humanization of forces, of which, except in the guise of religion, he had not the faintest conception. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament should his handiwork. He recalled that as a placard in one of his mother's mission windows. And another which read, "For he is thy life and thy length of days." Just the same, and far from it as yet, even in the face of his sudden predisposition toward the Reverend Duncan Macmillan, was he seriously moved to assume that in religion of any kind was he likely to find surcease from his present miseries? And yet the weeks and months going by, the Reverend Macmillan calling regularly thereafter, every 2 weeks at the longest, sometimes every week, and inquiring after his state, listening to his wants, advising him as to his health and peace of mind. And Clyde, anxious to retain his interest and visits, gradually, more and more, yielding himself to his friendship and influence. That high spirituality. That beautiful voice. And quoting always such soothing things. "Brethren, now are we the children of God. And it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that has this hope in him purifieth himself even as he is pure. Hereby know that we dwell in him and he in us, because he hath given us of his Spirit. For ye are bought with a price. Of his own will begot he us with the word of truth, and we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And every good and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Draw nigh unto God and he will draw nigh unto you." He was inclined, at times, to feel that there might be peace and strength, aid, even, who could say, in appealing to this power. It was the force and the earnestness of the Reverend Macmillan operating upon him. And yet, the question of repentance, and with it confession. But to whom? The Reverend Duncan Macmillan, of course. He seemed to feel that it was necessary for Clyde to purge his soul to him, or someone like him, a material and yet spiritual emissary of God. But just there was the trouble. For there was all of that false testimony he had given in the trial, yet on which had been based his appeal. To go back on that now, and when his appeal was pending. Better wait, had he not, until he saw how that appeal had eventuated. But, how shabby, false, fleeting, insincere. To imagine that any god would bother with a person who sought to dicker in such a way. No, no. That was not right either. What would the Reverend Macmillan think of him if he knew what he was thinking? But again there was the troubling question in his own mind as to his real guilt, the amount of it. True, there was no doubt that he had plotted to kill Roberta there at first, a most dreadful thing as he now saw it. For the complications and the fever in connection with his desire for Sandra having subsided somewhat, it was possible on occasion now for him to reason without the desperate sting and ting of the mental state that had characterized him at the time when he was so immediately in touch with her. Those terrible, troubled days when in spite of himself, as he now understood it, Belknap's argument having cleared it up for him, he had burned with that wild fever which was not unakin in its manifestations to a form of insanity. The beautiful Sandra. The glorious Sandra. The witchery and fire of her smile then. Even now that dreadful fever was not entirely out but only smoldering, smothered by all of the dreadful things that had since happened to him. Also, it must be said on his behalf now, must it not, that never, under any other circumstances, would he have succumbed to any such terrible thought or plot as that, to kill anyone, let alone a girl like Roberta, unless he had been so infatuated, lunatic, even. But had not the jury there at Bridgeburg listened to that plea with contempt? And would the Court of Appeals think differently? He feared not. And yet was it not true? Or was he all wrong? Or what? Could the Reverend Macmillan or anyone else to whom he would explain tell him as to that? He would like to talk to him about it, confess everything perhaps, in order to get himself clear on all this. Further, there was the fact that having plotted for Sandra's sake, and God, if no one else, knew that, he still had not been able to execute it. And that had not been brought out in the trial, because the false form of defense used permitted no explanation of the real truth then, and yet it was a mitigating circumstance, was it not, or would the Reverend Macmillan think so? A lie had to be used, as Jephson saw it. But did that make it any the less true? There were phases of this thing, the tangles and doubts involved in that dark, savage plot of his, as he now saw and brooded on it, which were not so easily to be disposed of. Perhaps the two worst were, first, that in bringing Roberta there to that point on that lake, that lone spot, and then growing so weak and furious with himself because of his own incapacity to do evil, he had frightened her into rising and trying to come to him. And that in the first instance made it possible for her to be thus accidentally struck by him and so made him, in part at least, guilty of that blow, or did it a murderous, sinful blow in that sense? Maybe. What would the Reverend Macmillan say to that? And since because of that she had fallen into the water, was he not guilty of her falling? It was a thought that troubled him very much now, his constructive share of guilt in all that. Regardless of what Oberwalzer had said there at the trial in regard to his swimming away from her, that if she had accidentally fallen in the water, it was no crime on his part, supposing he refused to rescue her, still, as he now saw it, and especially when taken in connection with all that he had thought in regard to Roberta up to that moment, it was a crime just the same, was it not? Wouldn't God, Macmillan, think so? And unquestionably, as Mason had so shrewdly pointed out at the trial, he might have saved her. And would have too, no doubt, if she had been Sandra, or even the Roberta of the summer before. Besides, the fear of her dragging him down had been no decent fear. It was at nights in his bunk at this time that he argued and reasoned with himself, seeing that Macmillan was urging him now to repent and make peace with his God. Yes, he would have to admit that to himself. Decidedly and instantly he would have sought to save her life, if it had been Sandra. And such being the case, he would have to confess that, if he confessed at all to the Reverend Macmillan, or to whomever else one told the truth, when one did tell it, the public at large perhaps. But such a confession once made, would it not surely and truly lead to his conviction? And did he want to convict himself now and so die? No, no, better wait a while perhaps, At least until the Court of Appeals had passed on his case. Why jeopardize his case when God already knew what the truth was? Truly, truly he was sorry. He could see how terrible all this was now, how much misery and heartache, apart from the death of Roberta, he had caused. But still, was not life sweet? Oh, if he could only get out. Oh, if he could only go away from here, never to see or hear or feel anything more of this terrible terror that now hung over him. The slow coming dark, the slow coming dawn. The long night. The sighs, the groans. The tortures by day and by night until it seemed at times as though he should go mad, and would perhaps except for Macmillan, who now appeared devoted to him, so kind, appealing and reassuring, too, at times. He would just like to sit down some day, here or somewhere, and tell him all and get him to say how really guilty, if at all, he thought him to be, and if so guilty to get him to pray for him. At times he felt so sure that his mother's and the Reverend Duncan Macmillan's prayers would do him so much more good with this God than any prayers of his own would. Somehow he couldn't pray yet. And at times hearing Macmillan pray, softly and melodiously, his voice entering through the bars, or, reading from Galatians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, he felt as though he must tell him everything, and soon. But the days going by until finally one day 6 weeks after, and when because of his silence in regard to himself, the Reverend Duncan was beginning to despair of ever affecting him in any way toward his proper contrition and salvation, a letter or note from Sandra. It came through the warden's office and by the hand of the Reverend Preston Guilford, the Protestant chaplain of the prison, but was not signed. It was, however, on good paper, and because the rule of the prison so requiring had been opened and read. Nevertheless, on account of the nature of the contents which seemed to both the warden and the Reverend Guilford to be more charitable and punitive than otherwise, and because plainly, if not verifiably, it was from that missex of repute or notoriety in connection with his trial, it was decided, after due deliberation, that Clyde should be permitted to read it, even that it was best that he should. Perhaps it would prove of value as a lesson. The way of the transgressor. And so it was handed to him at the close of a late fall day, after a long and dreary summer had passed, soon a year since he had entered here. And he taking it. And although it was typewritten with no date nor place on the envelope, which was postmarked New York, yet sensing somehow that it might be from her. And growing decidedly nervous, so much so that his hand trembled slightly. And then reading, over and over and over, during many days thereafter, Clyde, this is so that you will not think that someone once dear to you has utterly forgotten you. She has suffered much, too. And though she can never understand how you could have done as you did, still, even now, although she is never to see you again, she is not without sorrow and sympathy and wishes you freedom and happiness. But no signature, no trace of her own handwriting. She was afraid to sign her name and she was too remote from him in her mood now to let him know where she was. New York. But it might have been sent there from anywhere to mail. And she would not let him know, would never let him know, even though he died here later, as well he might. His last hope, the last trace of his dream vanished. Forever. It was at that moment, as when night at last falls upon the faintest remaining gleam of dusk in the west. A dim, weakening tinge of pink, and then the dark. He seated himself on his cot. The wretched stripes of his uniform and his grey felt shoes took his eye. A felon. These stripes. These shoes. This cell. This uncertain, threatening prospect so very terrible to contemplate at any time. And then this letter. So this was the end of all that wonderful dream. And for this he had sought so desperately to disengage himself from Roberta, even to the point of deciding to slay her. This. He toyed with the letter, then held it quite still. Where was she now? Who in love with? Maybe? She had had time to change perhaps. She had only been captivated by him a little, maybe. And then that terrible revelation in connection with him had destroyed forever, no doubt, all sentiment in connection with him. She was free. She had beauty, wealth. Now some other. He got up and walked to his cell door to still a great pain. Over the way, in that cell the Chinaman had once occupied, was a Negro, Wash Higgins. He had stabbed a waiter in a restaurant, so it was said, who had refused him food and then insulted him. And next to him was a young Jew. He had killed the proprietor of a jewelry store in trying to rob it. But he was very broken and collapsed now that he was here to die, sitting for the most part all day on his cot, his head in his hands. Clyde could see both now from where he stood, the Jew holding his head. But the Negro on his cot, one leg above the other, smoking, and singing, "Oh, Big Will Rollin'. HMP. Oh, Big Will Rollin'. HMP. Oh, Big Will Rollin'. HMP. Fa me. Fa me." And then Clyde, unable to get away from his own thoughts, turning again. Condemned to die. And this was the end as to Sandra. He could feel it. Farewell. Although she is never to see you again. He threw himself on his couch, not to weep but to rest, he felt so weary. Lycurgus. Fourth Lake. Bear Lake. Laughter, kisses, smiles. What was to have been in the fall of the preceding year? And now, a year later. But then that young Jew. There was some religious chant into which he fell when his mental tortures would no longer endure silence. And oh, how sad. Many of the prisoners had cried out against it. And yet, oh, how appropriate now, somehow. I have been evil. I have been unkind. I have lied. Oh. 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 I have been unfaithful. My heart has been wicked. I have joined with those who have done evil things. Oh. 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 I have stolen. I have been false. I have been cruel. Oh. 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 And the voice of Big Tom Rooney sentenced for killing Thomas Tighe, a rival for the hand of an underworld girl. For Christ's sake. I know you feel bad. But so do I. Oh, for God's sake, don't do that. Clyde, on his cot, his thoughts responding rhythmically to the chant of the Jew, and joining with him silently, I have been evil. I have been unkind. I have lied. Oh. 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 I have been unfaithful. My heart has been wicked. I have joined with those who have done evil things. Oh. 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 I have been false. I have been cruel. I have sought to murder. Oh. 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 And for what? A vain, impossible dream. Oh. 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 When the guard, an hour later, placed his supper on the shelf in the door, he made no move. Food. And when the guard returned in another 30 minutes, there it was, still untouched, as was the Jew's, and was taken away in silence. Guards knew when blue devils had seized the inmates of these cages. They couldn't eat. And there were times, too, when even guards couldn't eat. Chapter 33. The depression resulting even after 2 days was apparent to the Reverend Macmillan, who was concerned to know why. More recently, he had been led to believe by Clyde's manner, his visits, if not the fact that the totality of his preachments had not been greeted with as much warmth as he would have liked, that by degrees Clyde was being won to his own spiritual viewpoint. With no little success, as it had seemed to him, he had counseled Clyde as to the folly of depression and despair. What? Was not the peace of God within his grasp and for the asking? To one who sought God and found him, as he surely would, if he sought, there could be no sorrow, but only joy. Hereby know we that we dwell in him, and he in us, because he hath given us of his Spirit. So he preached or read, until finally, 2 weeks after receiving the letter from Sandra and because of the deep depression into which he had sunk on account of it, Clyde was finally moved to request of him that he try to induce the warden to allow him to be taken to some other cell or room apart from this room or cell, which seemed to Clyde to be filled with too many of his tortured thoughts, in order that he might talk with him and get his advice. As he told the Reverend Macmillan, he did not appear to be able to solve his true responsibility in connection with all that had so recently occurred in his life, and because of which he seemed not to be able to find that peace of mind of which Macmillan talked so much. Perhaps, there must be something wrong with his viewpoint. Actually, he would like to go over the offense of which he was convicted and see if there was anything wrong in his understanding of it. He was not so sure now. And Macmillan, greatly stirred, an enormous spiritual triumph, this, as he saw it, the true reward of faith and prayer, at once proceeding to the warden, who was glad enough to be of service in such a cause. And he permitted the use of one of the cells in the old death house for as long as he should require, and with no guard between himself and Clyde, one only remaining in the general hall outside. And there Clyde began the story of his relations with Roberta and Sandra. Yet because of all that had been set forth at the trial, merely referring to most of the evidence, apart from his defense, the change of heart, as so, afterwards dwelling more particularly on the fatal adventure with Roberta in the boat. Did the Reverend Macmillan, because of the original plotting, and hence the original intent, think him guilty? Especially in view of his obsession over Sandra, all his dreams in regard to her, did that truly constitute murder? He was asking this because, as he said, it was as he had done, not as his testimony at the trial had indicated that he had done. It was a lie that he had experienced a change of heart. His attorneys had counseled that defense as best, since they did not feel that he was guilty, and had thought that plan the quickest route to liberty. But it was a lie. In connection with his mental state also there in the boat, before and after her rising and attempting to come to him, and that blow, and after, he had not told the truth either, quite. That unintentional blow, as he now wished to explain, since it affected his efforts at religious meditation, a desire to present himself honestly to his Creator, if at all. He did not then explain that as yet he had scarcely attempted to so present himself. There was more to it than he had been able yet to make clear, even to himself. In fact, even now to himself there was much that was evasive and even insoluble about it. He had said that there had been no anger, that there had been a change of heart. But there had been no change of heart. In fact, just before she had risen to come to him, there had been a complex troubled state, bordering, as he now saw it, almost upon trance or palsy, and due, but he could scarcely say to what it was due, exactly. He had thought at first, or afterwards, that it was partly due to pity for Roberta, or, at least the shame of so much cruelty in connection with her, his plan to strike her. At the same time there was anger, too, hate maybe, because of her determination to force him to do what he did not wish to do. Thirdly, yet he was not so sure as to that. He had thought about it so long, and yet he was not sure even now. There might have been fear as to the consequences of such an evil deed, although, just at that time, as it seemed to him now, he was not thinking of the consequences, or of anything save his inability to do as he had come to do, and feeling angry as to that. Yet in the blow, the accidental blow that had followed upon her rising and attempting to come to him, had been some anger against her for wanting to come near him at all. And that it was perhaps, he was truly not sure, even now, that had given that blow its so destructive force. It was so afterward, anyhow, that he was compelled to think of it. And yet there was also the truth that in rising he was seeking to save her, even in spite of his hate. That he was also, for the moment at least, sorry for that blow. Again, though, once the boat had upset and both were in the water, in all that confusion, and when she was drowning, he had been moved by the thought, do nothing. For thus he would be rid of her. Yes, he had so thought. But again, there was the fact that all through, as Mr. Belknap and Mr. Jeffson had pointed out, he had been swayed by his obsession for Miss X, the supermotivating force in connection with all of this. But now, did the Reverend Macmillan, considering all that went before and all that came after, the fact that the unintentional blow still had anger in it, angry dissatisfaction with her, really, and that afterwards he had not gone to her rescue, as now, honestly and truly as he was trying to show, did he think that that constituted murder, mortal blood guilt for which spiritually, as well as legally, he might be said to deserve death? Did he? He would like to know for his own soul's peace, so that he could pray, maybe. The Reverend Macmillan, hearing all this, and never in his life before having heard or having had passed to him so intricate and elusive and strange a problem, and because of Clyde's faith in and regard for him, enormously impressed. And now sitting before him quite still and pondering most deeply, sadly and even nervously, so serious and important was this request for an opinion, something which, as he knew, Clyde was counting on to give him earthly and spiritual peace. But, nonetheless, the Reverend Macmillan was himself too puzzled to answer so quickly. Up to the time you went in that boat with her, Clyde, you had not changed in your mood toward her, your intention to. The Reverend Macmillan's face was grey and drawn. His eyes were sad. He had been listening, as he now felt, to a sad and terrible story, an evil and cruel self-torturing and destroying story. This young boy, really. His hot, restless heart, which plainly for the lack of so many things which he, the Reverend Macmillan, had never wanted for, had rebelled. And because of that rebellion had sinned mortally and was condemned to die. Indeed, his reason was as intensely troubled as his heart was moved. No, I had not. You were, as you say, angry with yourself for being so weak as not to be able to do what you had planned to do. In a way it was like that, yes. But then I was sorry, too, you see. And maybe afraid. I'm not exactly sure now. Maybe not, either. The Reverend Macmillan shook his head. So strange. So evasive. So evil. And yet, but at the same time, as you say, you were angry with her for having driven you to that point. Yes. Where you were compelled to wrestle with so terrible a problem. Yes. TST. 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 And so you thought of striking her. Yes, I did. But you could not. No. Praised be the mercy of God. Yet in the blow that you did strike, unintentionally, as you say, there was still some anger against her. That was why the blow was so severe. You did not want her to come near you. No, I didn't. I think I didn't, anyhow. I'm not quite sure. It may be that I wasn't quite right. Anyhow, all worked up, I guess, sick almost. In his uniform, his hair cropped so close, Clyde sat there, trying honestly now to think how it really was, exactly, and greatly troubled by his inability to demonstrate to himself even, either his guilt or his lack of guilt. Was he, or was he not? And the Reverend Macmillan, himself intensely strained, muttering, "Wide is the gate and broad the way that leadeth to destruction." And yet finally adding, "But you did rise to save her." Yes, afterwards, I got up. I meant to catch her after she fell back. That was what upset the boat. And you did really want to catch her? I don't know. At the moment I guess I did. Anyhow I felt sorry, I think. But can you say now truly and positively, as your Creator sees you, that you were sorry, or that you wanted to save her then? It all happened so quick, you see, began Clyde nervously, hopelessly, almost, that I'm not just sure. No, I don't know that I was so very sorry. No. I really don't know, you see, now. Sometimes I think maybe I was, a little, sometimes not, maybe. But after she was gone and I was on shore, I felt sorry, a little. But I was sort of glad, too, you know, to be free, and yet frightened, too, you see, yes, I know. You were going to that Miss Expert out there, when she was in the water. No. You did not want to go to her rescue? No. TST. 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 You felt no sorrow? No shame? Then? Yes, shame, maybe. Maybe sorrow, too, a little. I knew it was terrible. I felt that it was, of course. But still, you see, yes, I know. That Miss X. You wanted to get away. Yes, but mostly I was frightened, and I didn't want to help her. Yes. Yes. TST. 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 If she drowned you could go to that Miss X. You thought of that? The Reverend Macmillan's lips were tightly and sadly compressed. "Yes. My son. My son. In your heart was murder then?" "Yes, yes," Clyde said reflectively. "I have thought since it must have been that way." The Reverend Macmillan paused and to hearten himself for this task began to pray, but silently, and to himself, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." He stirred again after a time. "Ah, Clyde. The mercy of God is equal to every sin. I know it. He sent his own Son to die for the evil of the world. It must be so, if you will but repent. But that thought, that deed. You have much to pray for, my son, much. Oh, yes. For in the sight of God, I fear, yes, and yet, I must pray for enlightenment. This is a strange and terrible story. There are so many phases. It may be, but pray. Pray with me now that you and I may have light." He bowed his head. He sat for minutes in silence, while Clyde, also, in silence and troubled doubt, sat before him. Then, after a time he began, "O Lord, rebuke me not in thine anger, neither chasten me in thy hot displeasure. Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak. Heal me in my shame and sorrow, for my soul is wounded and dark in thy sight. Oh, let the wickedness of my heart pass. Lead me, O God, into thy righteousness. Let the wickedness of my heart pass and remember it not." Clyde, his head down, sat still, very still. He, himself, was at last shaken and mournful. No doubt his sin was very great. Very, very terrible. And yet, but then, the Reverend Macmillan ceasing and rising, he, too, rose, the while Macmillan added, "But I must go now. I must think, pray. This has troubled and touched me deeply. Oh, very, Lord. And you, my son, you return and pray, alone. Repent. Ask of God on your knees his forgiveness and he will hear you. Yes, he will. And tomorrow, or as soon as I honestly can, I will come again. But do not despair. Pray always, for in prayer alone, prayer and contrition, is salvation. Rest in the strength of him who holds the world in the hollow of his hand. In his abounding strength and mercy, is peace and forgiveness. Oh, yes." He struck the iron door with a small key-ring that he carried, and at once the guard, hearing it, returned. Then, having escorted Clyde to his cell and seen him once more shut within that restraining cage, he took his own departure, heavily and miserably burdened with all that he had heard. And Clyde was left to brood on all he had said, and how it had affected Macmillan, as well as himself. His new friend's stricken mood. The obvious pain and horror with which he viewed it all. Was he really and truly guilty? Did he really and truly deserve to die for this? Was that what the Reverend Macmillan would decide? And in the face of all his tenderness and mercy? And another week in which, moved by Clyde's seeming contrition, and all the confusing and extenuating circumstances of his story, and having wrestled most earnestly with every moral aspect of it, the Reverend Macmillan once more before his cell door, but only to say that however liberal or charitable his interpretation of the facts, as at last Clyde had truthfully pictured them, still he could not feel that either primarily or secondarily could he be absolved from guilt for her death. He had plotted, had he not? He had not gone to her rescue when he might have. He had wished her dead and afterwards had not been sorry. In the blow that had brought about the upsetting of the boat had been some anger. Also in the mood that had not permitted him to strike. The facts that he had been influenced by the beauty and position of Miss X to the plotting of this deed, and, after his evil relations with Roberta, that she had been determined he should marry her, far from being points in extenuation of his actions, were really further evidence of his general earthly sin and guilt. Before the Lord then he had sinned in many ways. In those dark days, alas, as Mr. Macmillan saw it, he was little more than a compound of selfishness and unhallowed desire and fornication against the evil of which Paul had thundered. It had endured to the end and had not changed, until he had been taken by the law. He had not repented, not even there at Bear Lake where he had time for thought. And besides, had he not, from the beginning to end, bolstered it with false and evil pretenses? Verily. On the other hand, no doubt if he were sent to the chair now in the face of his first, and yet so clear manifestation of contrition, when now, for the first time he was beginning to grasp the enormity of his offense, it would be but to compound crime with crime, the state in this instance being the aggressor. For, like the warden and many others, Macmillan was against capital punishment, preferring to compel the wrongdoer to serve the state in some way. But, nonetheless, he felt himself compelled to acknowledge, Clyde was far from innocent. Think as he would, and however much spiritually he desired to absolve him, was he not actually guilty? In vain it was that Macmillan now pointed out to Clyde that his awakened moral and spiritual understanding more perfectly and beautifully fitted him for life and action than ever before. He was alone. He had no one who believed in him. No one. He had no one, whom, in any of his troubled and tortured actions before that crime saw anything but the darkest guilt apparently. And yet, and this despite Sandra and the Reverend Macmillan and all the world for that matter, Mason, the jury at Bridgeburg, the Court of Appeals at Albany, if it should decide to confirm the jury at Bridgeburg, he had a feeling in his heart that he was not as guilty as they all seemed to think. After all, they had not been tortured as he had by Roberta with her determination that he marry her and thus ruin his whole life. They had not burned with that unquenchable passion for the Sandra of his beautiful dream as he had. They had not been harassed, tortured, mocked by the ill fate of his early life and training, forced to sing and pray on the streets as he had in such a degrading way, when his whole heart and soul cried out for better things. How could they judge him, these people, all or any one of them, even his own mother, when they did not know what his own mental, physical and spiritual suffering had been? And as he lived through it again in his thoughts at this moment, the sting and mental poison of it was as real to him as ever. Even in the face of all the facts and as much as everyone felt him to be guilty, there was something so deep within him that seemed to cry out against it that, even now, at times, it startled him. Still, there was the Reverend Macmillan. He was a very fair and just and merciful man. Surely he saw all this from a higher light and better viewpoint than his own. While at times he felt strongly that he was innocent, at others he felt that he must be guilty. Oh, these evasive and tangled and torturesome thoughts. Would he never be able, quite, to get the whole thing straightened out in his own mind? So Clyde, not being able to take advantage truly of either the tenderness and faith and devotion of so good and pure a soul as the Reverend Macmillan or the all-merciful and all-powerful God of whom here he stood as the ambassador. What was he to do, really? How pray, resignedly, unreservedly, faithfully? And in that mood, and because of the urge of the Reverend Duncan, who was convinced by Clyde's confession that he must have been completely infused with the Spirit of God, once more thumbing through the various passages and chapters pointed out to him, reading and rereading the Psalms most familiar to him, seeking from their inspiration to catch the necessary contrition, which once caught would give him that peace and strength which in those long and dreary hours he so much desired. Yet never quite catching it. Parallel with all this, 4 more months passed. And at the end of that time, in January, 19, the Court of Appeals finding, Fulham Jr., reviewing the evidence as offered by Belknap and Jeffson, with Kincaid, Briggs, Truman and Dobshutter concurring, that Clyde was guilty as decided by the Cataraqui County jury and sentencing him to die at some time within the week beginning February 28 or 6 weeks later, and saying in conclusion, "We are mindful that this is a case of circumstantial evidence and that the only eyewitness denies that death was the result of crime. But in obedience to the most exacting requirements of that manner of proof, the counsel for the people, with very unusual thoroughness and ability, has investigated and presented evidence of a great number of circumstances for the purpose of truly solving the question of the defendant's guilt or innocence. We might think that the proof of some of these facts standing by themselves was subject to doubt by reason of unsatisfactory or contradictory evidence, and that other occurrences might be so explained or interpreted as to be reconcilable with innocence. The defense, invariably, sought to enforce this view. But taken all together and considered as a connected whole, they make such convincing proof of guilt that we are not able to escape from its force by any justifiable process of reasoning, and we are compelled to say that not only is the verdict not opposed to the weight of evidence, and to the proper inference to be drawn from it, but that it is abundantly justified thereby. Decision of the lower court unanimously confirmed. On hearing this, Macmillan, who was in Syracuse at the time, hurrying to Clyde in the hope that before the news was conveyed officially, he should be there to encourage him spiritually, since, only with the aid of the Lord, as he saw it, the eternal and ever-present help in trouble, would Clyde be able to endure so heavy a blow. And finding him, for which he was most deeply grateful, wholly unaware of what had occurred, since no news of any kind was conveyed to any condemned man until the warrant for his execution had arrived. After a most tender and spiritual conversation, in which he quoted from Matthew, Paul and John as to the unimportance of this world, the true reality and joy of the next, Clyde was compelled to learn from Macmillan that the decision of the court had gone against him. And that though Macmillan talked of an appeal to the governor which he, and some others whom he was sure to be able to influence would make, unless the governor chose to act, within 6 weeks, as Clyde knew, he would be compelled to die. And then, once the force of that fact had finally burst on him, and while Macmillan talked on about faith and the refuge which the mercy and wisdom of God provided, Clyde, standing before him with more courage and character showing in his face and eyes than at any time previously in his brief and eager career. So they decided against me. Now I will have to go through that door after all, like all those others. They'll draw the curtains for me, too. Into that other room, then back across the passage, saying goodbye as I go, like those others. I will not be here any more. He seemed to be going over each step in his mind, each step with which he was so familiar, only now, for the first time, he was living it for himself. Now, in the face of this dread news, which somehow was as fascinating as it was terrible, feeling not as distrait or weak as at first he had imagined he would be. Rather, to his astonishment, considering all his previous terror in regard to this, thinking of what he would do, what he would say, in an outwardly calm way. Would he repeat prayers read to him by the Reverend Macmillan here? No doubt. And maybe gladly, too. And yet, in his momentary trance he was unconscious of the fact that the Reverend Duncan was whispering, "But you see, we haven't reached the end of this yet. There is a new governor coming into office in January. He is a very sensible and kindly man, I hear. In fact, I know several people who know him, and it is my plan to see him personally, as well as to have some other people whom I know write him on the strength of what I will tell them." But from Clyde's look at the moment, as well as what he now said, he could tell that he was not listening. "My mother. I suppose someone ought to telegraph her. She is going to feel very bad. And then, I don't suppose they believed that those letters shouldn't have been introduced just as they were, did they? I thought maybe they would." He was thinking of Nicholson. "Don't worry, Clyde," replied the tortured and saddened Macmillan, at this point more eager to take him in his arms and comfort him than to say anything at all. "I have already telegraphed your mother. As for that decision, I will see your lawyers right away. Besides, as I say, I propose to see the governor myself. He is a new man, you see." Once more he was now repeating all that Clyde had not heard before. Chapter 34. The scene was the executive chamber of the newly elected governor of the state of New York some 3 weeks after the news conveyed to Clyde by Macmillan. After many preliminary and futile efforts on the part of Belknap and Jeffson to obtain a commutation of the sentence of Clyde from death to life imprisonment, the customary filing of a plea for clemency, together with such comments as they had to make in regard to the way the evidence had been misinterpreted and the illegality of introducing the letters of Roberta in their original form, to all of which Governor Waltham, an ex-district attorney and judge from the southern part of the state, had been conscientiously compelled to reply that he could see no reason for interfering, there was now before Governor Waltham Mrs. Griffiths together with the Reverend Macmillan. For, moved by the widespread interest in the final disposition of Clyde's case, as well as the fact that his mother, because of her unshaken devotion to him, and having learned of the decision of the Court of Appeals, had once more returned to Auburn and since then had been appealing to the newspapers, as well as to himself through letters for a correct understanding of the extenuating circumstances surrounding her son's downfall, and because she herself had repeatedly appealed to him for a personal interview in which she should be allowed to present her deepest convictions in regard to all this, the governor had at last consented to see her. It could do no harm. Besides, it would tend to soothe her. Also, variable public sentiment, whatever its convictions in any given case, was usually on the side of the form or gesture of clemency, without, however, any violence to its convictions. And, in this case, if one could judge by the newspapers, the public was convinced that Clyde was guilty. On the other hand, Mrs. Griffiths, owing to her own long meditations in regard to Clyde, Roberta, his sufferings during and since the trial, the fact that according to the Reverend Macmillan he had at last been won to a deep contrition and a spiritual union with his Creator whatever his original sin, was now more than ever convinced that humanity and even justice demanded that at least he be allowed to live. And so, standing before the governor, a tall, sober and somewhat somber man who, never in all his life had even so much as sensed the fevers or fires that Clyde had known, yet who, being a decidedly affectionate father and husband, could very well sense what Mrs. Griffith's present emotions must be. Yet greatly exercised by the compulsion which the facts, as he understood them, as well as a deep-seated and unchangeable submission to law and order, thrust upon him. Like the pardon clerk before him, he had read all the evidence submitted to the Court of Appeals, as well as the latest briefs submitted by Belknap and Jeffson. But on what grounds could he, David Waltham, and without any new or varying data of any kind, just a reinterpretation of the evidence as already passed upon, venture to change Clyde's death sentence to life imprisonment? Had not a jury, as well as the Court of Appeals, already said he should die? In consequence, as Mrs. Griffiths began her plea, her voice shaky, retracing as best she could the story of Clyde's life, his virtues, the fact that at no time ever had he been a bad or cruel boy, that Roberta, if not Miss X, was not entirely guiltless in the matter, he merely gazed at her deeply moved. The love and devotion of such a mother. Her agony in this hour, her faith that her son could not be as evil as the proven facts seemed to indicate to him and everyone else. Oh, my dear governor, how can the sacrifice of my son's life now, and when spiritually he has purged his soul of sin and is ready to devote himself to the work of God, repay the state for the loss of that poor, dear girl's life, whether it was accidentally or otherwise taken? How can it? Cannot the millions of people of the state of New York be merciful? Cannot you as their representative exercise the mercy that they may feel? Her voice broke, she could not go on. Instead she turned her back and began to cry silently, while Waltham, shaken by an emotion he could not master, merely stood there. This poor woman. So obviously honest and sincere. Then the Reverend Macmillan, seeing his opportunity, now entering his plea. Clyde had changed. He could not speak as to his life before, but since his incarceration, or for the last year, at least, he had come into a new understanding of life, duty, his obligations to man and God. If but the death sentence could be commuted to life imprisonment, and the governor, who was a very earnest and conscientious man, listened with all attention to Macmillan, whom, as he saw and concluded was decidedly an intense and vital and highly idealistic person. No question in his own mind but what the words of this man, whatever they were, would be true, in so far as his own understanding would permit the conception of a truth. But you, personally, Mr. Macmillan, the governor at last found voice to say, because of your long contact with him in the prison there, do you know of any material fact not introduced at the trial which would in any way tend to invalidate or weaken any phase of the testimony offered at the trial? As you must know, this is a legal proceeding. I cannot act upon sentiment alone, and especially in the face of the unanimous decision of two separate courts." He looked directly at Macmillan, who, pale and dumb, now gazed at him in return. For now upon his word, upon his shoulders apparently was being placed the burden of deciding as to Clyde's guilt or innocence. But could he do that? Had he not decided, after due meditation as to Clyde's confessions, that he was guilty before God and the law? And could he now, for mercy's sake, and in the face of his deepest spiritual conviction, alter his report of his conviction? Would that be true, white, valuable before the Lord? And as instantly deciding that he, Clyde's spiritual adviser, must not in any way be invalidated in his spiritual worth to Clyde. "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall be salted?" And forthwith he declared, as his spiritual adviser, "I have entered only upon the spiritual, not the legal aspect of his life." And thereupon Waltham at once deciding, from something in Macmillan's manner, that he, like all others, apparently, was satisfied as to Clyde's guilt. And so, finally finding courage to say to Mrs. Griffiths, "Unless some definite evidence such as I have not yet seen and which will affect the legality of these two findings can be brought me, I have no alternative, Mrs. Griffiths, but to allow the verdict as written to stand. I am very sorry, oh, more than I can tell you. But if the law is to be respected, its decisions can never be altered except for reasons that in themselves are full of legal merit. I wish I could decide differently. I do indeed. My heart and my prayers go with you." He pressed a button. His secretary entered. It was plain that the interview was ended. Mrs. Griffiths, violently shaken and deeply depressed by the peculiar silence and evasion of Macmillan at the crucial moment of this interview, when the governor had asked such an all-important and direct question as to the guilt of her son, was still unable to say a word more. But now what? Which way? To whom to turn? God, and God only. She and Clyde must find in their Creator the solace for his failure and death in this world. And as she was thinking and still weeping, the Reverend Macmillan approached and gently led her from the room. When she was gone, the governor finally turned to his secretary. "Never in my life have I faced a sadder duty. It will always be with me." He turned and gazed out upon a snowy February landscape. And after this but 2 more weeks of life for Clyde, during which time, and because of his ultimate decision conveyed to him first by Macmillan, but in company with his mother, from whose face Clyde could read all, even before Macmillan spoke, and from whom he heard all once more as to his need of refuge and peace in God, his Saviour, he now walked up and down his cell, unable to rest for any length of time anywhere. For, because of this final completely convincing sensation, that very soon he was to die, he felt the need, even now, of retracing his unhappy life. His youth. Kansas City. Chicago. Lycurgus. Roberta and Sandra. How swiftly they and all that was connected with them passed in review. The few, brief, bright, intense moments. His desire for more, that intense desire he had felt there in Lycurgus after Sandra came, and now this. And now even this was ending, this, why, he had scarcely lived at all as yet, and these last 2 years so miserably between these crushing walls. And of this life but 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8 of the filtering and now feverish days left. They were going. But life, how was one to do without that, the beauty of the days, of the sun and rain, of work, love, energy, desire? Oh, he really did not want to die. He did not. Why say to him so constantly as his mother and the Reverend Macmillan now did to resolve all his care in divine mercy and think only of God, when now, was all. And yet the Reverend Macmillan insisting that only in Christ and the hereafter was real peace. Oh, yes, but just the same, before the governor might he not have said that he was not guilty, or at least not entirely guilty, if only he had seen it that way, that time, and then, why then the governor might have commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, might he not? For he had asked his mother what the Reverend Macmillan had said to the governor, yet without saying to her that he had ever confessed all to him, and she had replied that he had told him how sincerely he had humbled himself before the Lord, but not that he was not guilty. And Clyde, feeling how strange it was that the Reverend Macmillan could not conscientiously bring himself to do more than that for him. How sad! How hopeless! Would no one ever understand, or give him credit for his human, if all too human and perhaps wrong hungers, yet from which so many others, along with himself, suffered? But worse yet, if anything, Mrs. Griffiths, because of what the Reverend Macmillan had said, or failed to say, in answer to the final question asked by Governor Waltham, and although subsequently in answer to an inquiry of her own, he had repeated the statement, she was staggered by the thought that perhaps, after all, Clyde was as guilty as at first she had feared. And because of that, asking at one point, "Clyde, if there is anything you have not confessed, you must confess it before you go." "I have confessed everything to God and to Mr. Macmillan, Mother." "Isn't that enough?" "No, Clyde. You have told the world that you are innocent. But if you are not, you must say so." "But if my conscience tells me that I am right, is not that enough?" "No, not if God's word says differently, Clyde," replied Mrs. Griffiths nervously, and with great inward spiritual torture. But he chose to say nothing further at that time. How could he discuss with his mother or the world the strange shadings which in his confession and subsequent talks with the Reverend Macmillan he had not been able to solve? It was not to be done. And because of that refusal on her son's part to confide in her, Mrs. Griffiths, tortured, not only spiritually but personally. Her own son, and so near death and not willing to say what already apparently he had said to Mr. Macmillan. Would not God ever be done with this testing her? And yet on account of what Macmillan had already said, that he considered Clyde, whatever his past sins, contrite and clean before the Lord, a youth truly ready to meet his Maker, she was prone to rest. The Lord was great. He was merciful. In his bosom was peace. What was death, what life, to one whose heart and mind were at peace with him? It was nothing. A few years, how very few, and she and Asa and after them, his brothers and sisters, would come to join him, and all his miseries here would be forgotten. But without peace in the Lord, the full and beautiful realization of his presence, love, care and mercy. She was tremulous at moments now in her spiritual exaltation, no longer quite normal, as Clyde could see and feel. But also by her prayers and anxiety as to his spiritual welfare, he was also able to see how little, really, she had ever understood of his true moods and aspirations. He had longed for so much there in Kansas City and he had had so little. Things, just things, had seemed very important to him, and he had so resented being taken out on the street as he had been, before all the other boys and girls, many of whom had all the things that he so craved, and when he would have been glad to have been anywhere else in the world than out there, on the street. That mission life that to his mother was so wonderful, yet, to him, so dreary. But was it wrong for him to feel so? Had it been? Would the Lord resent it now? And, maybe, she was right as to her thoughts about him. Unquestionably he would have been better off if he had followed her advice. But how strange it was, that to his own mother, and even now in these closing hours, when above all things he craved sympathy, but more than sympathy, true and deep understanding, even now, and as much as she loved and sympathized with, and was seeking to aid him with all her strength in her stern and self-sacrificing way, still he could not turn to her now and tell her, his own mother, just how it all happened. It was as though there was an unsurmountable wall or impenetrable barrier between them, built by the lack of understanding, for it was just that. She would never understand his craving for ease and luxury, for beauty, for love, his particular kind of love that went with show, pleasure, wealth, position, his eager and immutable aspirations and desires. She could not understand these things. She would look on all of it as sin, evil, selfishness. And in connection with all the fatal steps involving Roberta and Sandra, as adultery, unchastity, murder, even. And she would and did expect him to be terribly sorry and wholly repentant, when, even now, and for all he had said to the Reverend Macmillan and to her, he could not feel so, not wholly so, although great was his desire now to take refuge in God, but better yet, if it were only possible, in her own understanding and sympathetic heart. If it were only possible. Lord, it was all so terrible. He was so alone, even in these last few and elusive hours, the swift passing of the days, with his mother and also the Reverend Macmillan here with him, but neither understanding. But, apart from all this and much worse, he was locked up here and they would not let him go. There was a system, a horrible routine system, as long since he had come to feel it to be so. It was iron. It moved automatically like a machine without the aid or the hearts of men. These guards. They with their letters, their inquiries, their pleasant and yet really hollow words, their trips to do little favors, or to take the men in and out of the yard or to their baths, they were iron, too, mere machines, automatons, pushing and yet restraining one, within these walls, as ready to kill as to favor in case of opposition, but pushing, always toward that little door over there, from which there was no escape, just on and on, until at last they would push him through it never to return. Never to return. Each time he thought of this he arose and walked the floor. Afterwards, usually, he resumed the puzzle of his own guilt. He tried to think of Roberta and the evil he had done her, to read the Bible, even, lying on his face on the iron cot, repeating over and over, Lord, give me peace. Lord, give me light. Lord, give me strength to resist any evil thoughts that I should not have. I know I am not wholly white. Oh, no. I know I plotted evil. Yes, I know that. I confess. But must I really die now? Is there no help? Will you not help me, Lord? Will you not manifest yourself, as my mother says you will, for me? Will you get the governor to change my sentence before the final moment to life imprisonment? Will you get the Reverend Macmillan to change his views and go to him, and my mother, too? I will drive out all sinful thoughts. I will be different. Oh, yes, I will, if you will only spare me. Do not let me die now, so soon. Do not. I will pray. Yes, I will. Give me the strength to understand and believe, and pray. Oh, do. It was like this in those short, horrible days between the return of his mother and the Reverend Macmillan from their final visit to the governor and in his last hour that Clyde thought and prayed, yet finally in a kind of psychic terror, evoked by his uncertainty as to the meaning of the hereafter, his certainty of death, and the faith and emotions of his mother, as well as those of the Reverend Macmillan, who was about every day with his interpretations of divine mercy and his exhortations as to the necessity of complete faith and reliance upon it. He, himself coming at last to believe, not only must he have faith but that he had it, and peace, complete and secure. In that state, and at the request of the Reverend Macmillan, and his mother, finally composing, with the personal aid and supervision of Macmillan, who changed some of the sentences in his presence and with his consent, an address to the world, and more particularly to young men of his own years, which read, In the shadow of the valley of death it is my desire to do everything that would remove any doubt as to my having found Jesus Christ, the personal Savior and unfailing friend. My one regret at this time is that I have not given him the preeminence in my life while I had the opportunity to work for him. If I could only say some one thing that would draw young men to him I would deem it the greatest privilege ever granted me. But all I can now say is, I know in whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day, a quotation that Macmillan had familiarized him with. If the young men of this country could only know the joy and pleasure of a Christian life, I know they would do all in their power to become earnest, active Christians, and would strive to live as Christ would have them live. There is not one thing I have left undone which will bar me from facing my God, knowing that my sins are forgiven, for I have been free and frank in my talks with my spiritual adviser, and God knows where I stand. My task is done, The victory won. Clyde Griffiths. Having written this, a statement so unlike all the previous rebellious moods that had characterized him that even now he was, not a little impressed by the difference, handing it to Macmillan, who, heartened by this triumph, exclaimed, "And the victory is won, Clyde. This day shalt thou be with me in paradise. You have his word. Your soul and your body belong to him. Praised, everlastingly, be his name." And then so wrought up was he by this triumph, taking both Clyde's hands in his and kissing them and then folding him in his arms, my son, in whom I am well pleased. In you God has truly manifested his truth. His power to save. I see it. I feel it. Your address to the world is really his own voice to the world." And then pocketing the note with the understanding that it was to be issued after Clyde's death, not before. And yet Clyde, having written this, still dubious at moments. Was he truly saved? The time was so short? Could he rely on God with that absolute security which he had just announced now characterized him? Could he? Life was so strange. The future so obscure. Was there really a life after death, a God by whom he would be welcomed as the Reverend Macmillan and his own mother insisted? Was there? In the midst of this, 2 days before his death and in a final burst of panic, Mrs. Griffiths wiring the Honourable David Waltham, "Can you say before your God that you have no doubt of Clyde's guilt? Please wire. If you cannot, then his blood will be upon your head." His mother. And Robert Fessler, the secretary to the governor, replying by wire, "Governor Waltham does not think himself justified in interfering with the decision of the Court of Appeals." At last the final day, the final hour, Clyde's transfer to a cell in the old death house, where, after a shave and a bath, he was furnished with black trousers, a white shirt without a collar, to be opened at the neck afterwards, new felt slippers and grey socks. So accoutered, he was allowed once more to meet his mother and Macmillan, who, from 6 o'clock in the evening preceding the morning of his death until 4 of the final morning, were permitted to remain near him to counsel with him as to the love and mercy of God. And then at 4 the warden appearing to say that it was time, he feared, that Mrs. Griffiths depart, leaving Clyde in the care of Mr. Macmillan. The sad compulsion of the law, as he explained, and then Clyde's final farewell to his mother, before which, and in between the silences and painful twistings of heartstrings, he had managed to say, "Mama, you must believe that I die resigned and content. It won't be hard. God has heard my prayers. He has given me strength and peace." But to himself adding, "Had he?" And Mrs. Griffiths exclaiming, my son, I know. I have faith too. I know that my Redeemer liveth and that he is yours. Though we die, yet shall we live." She was looking heavenward, and seemed transfixed. Yet as suddenly turning to Clyde and gathering him in her arms and holding him long and firmly to her, whispering, "My son, my baby," and her voice broke and trailed off into breathlessness, and her strength seemed to be going all to him, until she felt she must leave or fall, and so she turned quickly and unsteadily to the warden, who was waiting for her to lead her to Auburn friends of Macmillan's. And then in the dark of this midwinter morning, the final moment, with the guards coming, first to slit his right trouser leg for the metal plate and then going to draw the curtains before the cells, "It is time, I fear. Courage, my son." It was the Reverend Macmillan, now accompanied by the Reverend Gibson, who, seeing the prison guards approaching, was then addressing Clyde. And Clyde now getting up from his cot, on which, beside the Reverend Macmillan, he had been listening to the reading of John 14, 15, 16, "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me." And then the final walk with the Reverend Macmillan on his right hand and the Reverend Gibson on his left, the guards front and rear. But with, instead of the customary prayers, the Reverend Macmillan announcing, "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God that he may exalt you in due time. Cast all your care upon him for he careth for you. Be at peace. Wise and righteous are his ways, who hath called us into his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that we have suffered a little. I am the way, the truth and the life, No man cometh unto the Father but by me. But various voices, as Clyde entered the first door to cross to the chair room, calling, "Goodbye, Clyde." And Clyde, with enough earthly thought and strength to reply, "Goodbye, all." But his voice sounding so strange and weak, even to himself, so far distant as though it emanated from another being walking alongside of him, and not from himself. And his feet were walking, but automatically, it seemed. And he was conscious of that familiar shuffle, as they pushed him on and on toward that door. Now it was here, now it was being opened. There it was, at last, the chair he had so often seen in his dreams, that he so dreaded, to which he was now compelled to go. He was being pushed toward that, into that, on, through the door which was now open, to receive him, but which was as quickly closed again on all the earthly life he had ever known. It was the Reverend Macmillan, who, grey and weary, a quarter of an hour later, walked desolately, and even a little uncertainly, as one who is physically very weak, through the cold doors of the prison. It was so faint, so weak, so grey as yet, this late winter day, and so like himself now. Dead. He, Clyde, had walked so nervously and yet somehow rustingly beside him but a few minutes before, and now he was dead. The law. Prisons such as this. Strong, evil men who scoffed betimes where Clyde had prayed. That confession. Had he decided truly, with the wisdom of God, as God gave him to see wisdom? Had he? Clyde's eyes. He, himself, the Reverend Macmillan had all but fainted beside him as that cap was adjusted to his head, that current turned on, and he had had to be assisted, sick and trembling, from the room, he upon whom Clyde had relied. And he had asked God for strength, was asking it. He walked along the silent street, only to be compelled to pause and lean against a tree, leafless in the winter, so bare and bleak. Clyde's eyes. That look as he sank limply into that terrible chair, his eyes fixed nervously and, as he thought, appealingly and dazedly upon him and the group surrounding him. Had he done right? Had his decision before Governor Waltham been truly sound, fair or merciful? Should he have said to him, that perhaps, there had been those other influences playing upon him? Was he never to have mental peace again, perhaps? "I know my Redeemer liveth and that he will keep him against that day." And then he walked and walked hours before he could present himself to Clyde's mother, who, on her knees in the home of the Reverend and Mrs. Francis Galt, Salvationists of Auburn, had been, since 4:30, praying for the soul of her son whom she still tried to visualize as in the arms of his Maker. "I know in whom I have believed," was a part of her prayer. Souvenir dusk, of a summer night. And the tall walls of the commercial heart of the city of San Francisco, tall and gray in the evening shade. And up a broad street from the south of Market, now comparatively hushed after the din of the day, a little band of 5, a man of about 60, short, stout, yet cadaverous as to the flesh of his face, and more especially about the pale, dim eyes, and with bushy white hair protruding from under a worn, round felt hat, a most unimportant and exhausted-looking person, who carried a small, portable organ such as is customarily used by street preachers and singers. And by his side, a woman not more than 5 years his junior, taller, not so broad, but solid of frame and vigorous, with snow-white hair and wearing an unrelieved costume of black, dress, bonnet, shoes. And her face broader and more characterful than her husband's, but more definitely seamed with lines of misery and suffering. At her side, again, carrying a Bible and several hymn books, a boy of not more than 7 or 8, very round-eyed and alert, who, because of some sympathetic understanding between him and his elderly companion, seemed to desire to walk close to her, a brisk and smart-stepping, although none too well-dressed boy. With these 3, again, but walking independently behind, a faded and unattractive woman of 27 or 8 and another woman of about 50, apparently, because of their close resemblance, mother and daughter. It was hot, with the sweet languor of a Pacific summer about it all. At Market, the great thoroughfare which they had reached, and because of threading throngs of automobiles and various lines of cars passing in opposite directions, they awaited the signal of the traffic officer. "Russell, stay close now." It was the wife speaking. "Better take hold of my hand." "It seems to me," commented the husband, very feeble and yet serene, "that the traffic here grows worse all the time." The cars clanged their bells. The automobiles barked and snorted. But the little group seemed entirely unconscious of anything save a set purpose to make its way across the street. "Street preachers," observed a passing bank clerk to his cashier girlfriend. "Sure, I see them up here nearly every Wednesday. Gee, it's pretty tough on a little kid, I should think. He's pretty small to be dragged around on the streets, don't you think, Ella?" "Well, I'll say so. I'd hate to see a brother of mine in on any such game. What kind of a life is that for a kid anyhow?" commented Ella as they passed on. Having crossed the street and reached the first intersection beyond, they paused and looked around as though they had reached their destination, the man putting down his organ which he proceeded to open, setting up, as he did so, a small but adequate music rack. At the same time his wife, taking from her grandson the several hymnals and the Bible he carried, gave the Bible as well as a hymnal to her husband, put one on the organ and gave one to each of the remaining group including one for herself. The husband looked somewhat vacantly about him, yet, none less with a seeming wide-eyed assurance, and began with, "We will begin with 276 tonight. How firm a foundation." "All right, Miss Schulf." At this the younger of the two women, very parched and spare, angular and homely, to whom life had denied quite all, seated herself upon the yellow camp chair and after arranging the stops and turning the leaves of the book, began playing the chosen hymn, to the tune of which they all joined in. By this time various homeward-bound individuals of diverse occupations and interests, noticing this small group so advantageously disposed near the principal thoroughfare of the city, hesitated a moment, either to eye them askance or to ascertain the character of their work. And as they sang, the nondescript and indifferent street audience gazed, held by the peculiarity of such an unimportant group publicly raising its voice against the vast skepticism and apathy of life. That gray and flabby and ineffectual old man, in his worn and baggy blue suit. This robust and yet uncouth and weary and white-haired woman. This fresh and unsoiled and unspoiled and uncomprehending boy. What was he doing here? And again that neglected and thin spinster and her equally thin and astray-looking mother. Of the group, the wife stood out in the eyes of the passers-by as having the force and determination which, however blind or erroneous, makes for self-preservation, if not real success in life. She, more than any of the others, stood up with an ignorant, yet somehow respectable air of conviction. And as several of the many who chanced to pause, watched her, her hymn book dropped to her side, her glance directed straight before her into space, each said on his way, "Well, here is one, who, whatever her defects, probably does what she believes as nearly as possible." A kind of hard, fighting faith in the wisdom and mercy of the definite overruling and watchful and merciful power which she proclaimed was written in her every feature and gesture. The song was followed with a long prayer and by the wife, then a sermon by the husband, testimonies by the others, all that God had done for them. Then the return march to the hall, the hymnals having been gathered, the organ folded and lifted by a strap over the husband's shoulder. And as they walked, it was the husband that commented, "A fine night." It seemed to me they were a little more attentive than usual. "Oh, yes," returned the younger woman that had played the organ. "At least 11 took tracks. And one old gentleman asked me where the mission was and when we held services." "Praise the Lord," commented the man. And then at last the mission itself, the Star of Hope. Bethel Independent Mission, meetings every Wednesday and Saturday night, 8 to 10. Sundays at 11, 3, 8. Everybody welcome. And under this legend in each window, "God is love." And below that again in smaller type, "How long since you wrote to Mother? Can I have a dime, Grandma? I want to go up to the corner and get an ice cream cone." It was the boy asking. "Yes, I guess so, Russell." But listen to me. You are to come right back. Yes, I will, Grandma, sure. You know me. He took the dime that his grandmother had extracted from a deep pocket in her dress and ran with it to the ice cream vendor. Her darling boy. The light and color of her declining years. She must be kind to him, more liberal with him, not restrain him too much, as maybe, she had. She looked affectionately and yet a little vacantly after him as he ran. For his sake. The small company, minus Russell, entered the yellow, unprepossessing door and disappeared.